Today, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Diane Ravitch. She is a professor of education at New York University and one of the most prominent critics of the dominant corporate-driven education policies currently being implemented around the country. Diane Ravitch was the Assistant Secretary of Education under George H.W. Bush, and she was appointed by the Clinton administration to the National Assessment Governing Board to oversee federal testing. She is currently an educational researcher and historian and the author and editor of dozens of books. Dr. Diane Ravitch, welcome to Flashpoints, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Great. You have an unusual resume for a leading critic of national education policy. You were a Washington insider, a leader in the U.S. Department of Education under two presidents, and you worked for some conservative think tanks that influenced the development of federal policies like No Child Left Behind. So can you start by just sharing with us a little bit about your own journey and what caused you to change your thinking about some of the policies that you helped to shape?
Well, I was for many years on the right. I worked in the George H.W. administration. When No Child Left Behind was proposed, I supported it. I continued to support it in various writings of mine and speaking and so forth. And I belong to two major right-wing think tanks, the Thomas B. Fordham Institute in Washington, D.C., and the Correct Task Force at the Hoover Institution in California. And the Correct Task Force and Fordham really represented, I would say, the intelligentsia of the right wing, very anti-union, although I was never anti-union, but very much pro-testing, pro-accountability, pro-high-stakes testing in particular, and pro-charter, and even pro-voucher. And I would have to say that over the years, as the evidence accumulated about No Child Left Behind, I became convinced that it was not helping anybody. It was actually doing damage. And as I watched the evidence accumulate about charter schools, I concluded that they weren't improving education, but they had become a means of privatization. And I had never been a supporter of privatization, or for that matter, vouchers. So I found myself increasingly disillusioned. I found myself increasingly the dissident within the Fordham Institute and within the Correct Task Force at Hoover. And over time, I became very critical and began writing critically, even while I was in these right-wing think tanks, writing critically about No Child Left Behind. And my views began to change in response to what I saw as very strong evidence that we were on the wrong path. And the more I came to this conclusion, the more my worldview changed. And I know that it's very unusual for someone in public life to change sides, but I very publicly changed sides, and I wrote about my change of view in a book that came out in 2010 called The Death and Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education. And the year before I quit both the Fordham Institute Board and the Correct Task Force, but I had stayed on until 2009 as an internal critic, and then I just reached a point where I thought, I don't agree with anything these institutes stand for, so I don't belong there. And I became increasingly outspoken in acknowledging that teaching is, first of all, it's a very hard job, and that the biggest problem in American education is not bad teachers, which is the current narrative on all sides, but poverty. We have outrageous levels of child poverty in this country. It's getting worse. And talking about charters and vouchers and all of these Common Core, these are all just a distraction from dealing with the most fundamental issue, which is that our society is tolerating growing racial segregation and levels of poverty, child poverty, that are unknown in other countries that are similar to our own in terms of being modern and advanced and industrialized.
Wow, that is a remarkable journey. And our focus for today is to really get a deeper understanding of that dominant narrative that you started to reference there and some of the key policies of so-called national education reform. And you address this so well in your latest book, Reign of Error, The Hoax of the Privatization Movement and the Danger to America's Public Schools. I just have to tell you that I personally have never read anything that provides such a thorough overview of the corporate education agenda, and with not just polemical arguments, but really well-documented research to back up your critique. So thank you for writing that.
Well, thank you. I felt, I explained in the beginning of the book that the reason I wrote it was because I was being shadowed by a reporter from the New Yorker, and he said, well, we know your criticisms. What are your proposals? And I said, well, you just heard me give a speech, that I've got a whole long list of things we ought to be doing instead of privatizing our schools and testing everyone to the point where children are crying. And he said, well, why don't you write another book? So that's how I came to write this book. But, I couldn't write the positive proposals until I had, again, assembled the evidence that what we're doing is not working. And there's even more evidence today than there was when I wrote the book. But it's very clear that whether you look at Texas, which just reported 3 years of stagnant test scores, whether you look at the international test scores, which I frankly don't put much faith in, we've seen no change really since over the past dozen years, despite No Child Left Behind, despite Race to the Top. And I think that anyone who says we need to test more, we need to make schools harder, is just seriously misinformed. And that's what I was trying to do in Reign of Error, was to gather the most current evidence and to do it historically, to say our schools are struggling and they're under attack. And I think that everyone needs to be aware of that. We cannot, as a democracy, allow our public schools to be destroyed by people who are seriously misinformed.
Right. And we're going to actually break down each of the components of this agenda, from charter schools to testing, standardized curriculum, et cetera. But I wonder if you can say a little more to kind of summarize the big picture for us. What is the main narrative about education today, the dominant narrative, and what are the key elements, just as an overview of that corporate-driven education agenda that's being promoted by Republicans, Democrats, wealthy philanthropists and entrepreneurs, and the corporate-controlled media?
The dominant narrative, which is called reform, it has nothing to do with the reforming schools. It really is intended to destroy public confidence in public education so that the public is willing to try anything. And there are many alternatives now being offered that have no evidence at all behind them and would destroy what I consider to be an essential institution of a democratic society, and that is a free public system of education that's adequately funded. But the dominant narrative says our schools are failing, our teachers are bad, we have to fire teachers. We have to find them and fire them. You need look only at the latest issue of Time magazine, which has a cover that says Rotten Apples, and it shows a gavel about to smash a perfectly healthy apple. And this is supposed to, it says on the cover why it's almost impossible to fire bad teachers and how tech millionaires are about to fix the problem. So it refers to the Vergara case in California, meaning that if you bring a lawsuit, you can smash teachers' due process rights, and then teachers can be fired very easily because they'll have no job rights at all. That's part of the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative is blame the teachers, and it's always couched in terms that are misleading, such as what we really need are quality teachers. The underlying assumption being we don't have quality teachers, and this occurs at a time where I believe we're facing a national teacher shortage because so many teachers are leaving. They're discouraged. They feel demeaned and disrespected by the public discourse. And the irony of all of this is, and I try to demonstrate this in my book, American schools today, despite all the complaints, are doing better than they've ever done in history. Despite everything you may have seen in the mainstream media, graduation rates are the highest they've ever been in history for every group, white, black, Hispanic, and Asian. Dropout rates are the lowest they've ever been in history. And the test scores on the only national measure we have, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, a federal test, the test scores are the highest they've ever been in history. They have not gone up very much in the last dozen years of No Child Left Behind, despite all the pressure, despite all the high stakes, despite all the threats and blandage, merit pay and all that sort of nonsense. The biggest gains were made before No Child Left Behind. So we've seen a slowing down of the improvement, but nonetheless, our test scores are higher than ever. And our schools are doing an incredible job, despite the fact that in most states the budgets have been cut, enrollment's going up, the number of teachers is going down. And we have more children today with special needs, with disabilities, more children who are English language learners who don't speak English and need extra help, and more children living in poverty. By some estimates, nationally, it's almost a quarter of our children. In many schools, it's a majority of the children living in poverty, meaning they don't have adequate food, medical care, or housing. And yet we expect schools to solve all these problems, and it's not going to happen.
Wow. So that really gives us a good overview. I'm wondering if you can, before we sort of dive into taking each of those pieces, if you can just say who some of the most powerful leaders and funders of the corporate education agenda are.
Well, the most powerful funder of the corporate education agenda would be the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation has been underwriting not only charter schools, but also this search for the perfect metric by which to measure teachers. And they have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on teacher evaluation, and it doesn't work. There are lawsuits all over the country where teachers have said, I've been teaching successfully for 15 years, 20 years. My kids do incredibly well, and they have evidence of their success, and yet they're rated ineffective by some algorithm that no one understands except the people, the economists and statisticians who created it. But the Gates Foundation is key. The Eli Broad Foundation has been very important because they have run an unaccredited superintendent training program for several years, and many of the superintendents across the country have been trained by the Eli Broad Foundation, and their main objective seems to be closing public schools and opening charter schools. And they actually have a handbook, which is all over the Internet, on how to prepare your community for closing public schools. And we have seen the rise of the charter movement, which I consider to be privatization because they are privately managed. They don't have to take the same kids that public schools do. They can kick out kids at will, which public schools cannot. And they're under private management. But in addition to the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, a huge funder is the very far right-wing Walton Foundation. So you have the Walton Foundation, which is the Walmart fortune, spending about $150 to $160 million every single year on an agenda of privatization, supporting charters, supporting vouchers, supporting Teach for America, supporting charter chains, et cetera. And then there are other foundations, the Dell Foundation, the Fisher Foundation, the John Arnold Foundation. He was an Enron trader for many years. And the numbers of foundations following the lead of the Gates Foundation are in the dozens. But all of these foundations are enabled and magnified. Their voices are magnified because they're working in concert with the U.S. Department of Education. So you have a bipartisan policy. Arnie Duncan is the chief cheerleader for charter schools, for Teach for America, which I consider a real threat to the education profession, since their teachers have only 5 weeks of training and send the message that you don't need any professional training in order to be a teacher. But Arnie Duncan has been the leading cheerleader for the Common Core, which I think is part and parcel of this corporate agenda, and for charter schools, and he has never, ever made a speech, as far as I know, where he has complained about cutting the budget in a state by $1 billion, or gone to cities where children don't have librarians or art teachers, and raised a ruckus saying that the schools are not being adequately funded. I have barely heard a peep about the growing segregation. I think on the anniversary of the Brown decision, he gave a speech, but there's no action from the U.S. Department of Education to actually do anything about segregation, which is, as has been documented time and again by the UCLA Civil Rights Project, it's getting worse, and charter schools are contributing to intensification of segregation. So the U.S. Department of Education is part and parcel of this corporate reform movement, and they work hand in glove with Gates and with Broad in particular.
And why are all these people so invested in this agenda? I mean, obviously, ideology is a piece of it, but what do they actually gain when these policies are adopted?
Well, I think that in the case of people like the billionaires, I don't think they're in it for the money. I think that they believe in the free market, and it is an ideological thing. They don't think that government can do anything right. You take like the Governor Cuomo of New York is a Democrat, but he just gave a talk the other day to a newspaper editorial board saying that as soon as the election's over, he wants to smash the public school monopoly. Well, that's public education, what he's calling the public school monopoly. It's a foundational function of government to provide free public education, and he wants to smash it and create more charter schools and place them all over the state. But that's an ideology, and many people are driven by a belief in the free market. They see education as just another business proposition. There are some people who are driven by money and who see profit, and many people have written recently about a charter owner in North Carolina who has 4 charter schools, and he's extracting millions of dollars in profit from his 4 charter schools because his for-profit company provides all the goods and services and bills the state for millions of dollars that don't go to the schools. So there is a profit incentive, but there are people who don't have a profit incentive but just believe that you let the free market work its miracle, and with all this competition, it will raise test scores. Of course, the more competition there is, the more the schools have their purposes distorted by testing into thinking that the only thing that matters about a school is test scores, and that's wrong too. That's the theology of high-stakes testing, which is if you put out enough incentives and enough punishments, everybody's going to focus on the test. And testing has become a huge industry in this country just in the past 12 to 15 years. And years ago, we didn't have all that much standardized testing. And I think that it's very sad. I mean, I have grandchildren who are in school now, in public school, and I feel sad for them because this is the way they will be judged. They will be stamped a 1, a 2, or a 3, or a 4. And I don't think that's right because there are kids who will never be at the top. Just by the nature of the bell curve, they will never be at the top, and they will be mislabeled and discouraged by this constant emphasis on standardized testing.
I wanted to take each of the main pillars of the corporate education agenda, and you've actually started into the first one that I was going to ask you about, which is the claim that standardized test scores are the best way to measure the success or failure of students, teachers, schools, in the educational system. And those who support the agenda say that test scores are falling, the racial achievement gap is widening, U.S. test scores are falling further behind other nations. This is all evidence that the educational system has failed and the country is in an educational crisis and an economic risk. And schools and districts are being forced to invest more and more time and money into these tests. So you've already addressed it somewhat, but I'm wondering if there's anything else you would want to comment about those claims.
Well, at bottom, these claims are baseless. Firstly, because the standardized tests just aren't that good. I spent 7 years on the governing board of the National Assessment for Educational Progress. That's the federal test. And I can't tell you how many times I saw test questions that were poor questions. They were, sometimes they had 2 right answers. And I'd say, wait a minute, this answer is just as good as that answer. And people would say, oh, you're right. It's gone through all the review panels. Sometimes they had no right answer. And again, the question would have to be sent back for rewriting. There's a wonderful book called Making the Grades by Todd Forley. And Todd Forley spent 15 years in the testing industry. And you read his stories about how these tests are scored, and it just curdles the blood to think that kids are being stamped good or bad, excellent or insufficient, ineffective, whatever, based on people who are being paid minimum wage, based on people who are hired off of Craigslist, who in many cases, or in most cases, are not educators, and they're being paid by how many tests and how quickly they can score them. And, the kids may have poured their heart into their answer, but their answer is given 15 or 20 or 30 seconds, and it's like boom, boom, boom. And the testing industry has been fattening. They have lobbyists in Washington. I mean, this was a shock to me when I was on the governing board to discover that there were many lobbyists from the testing industry who were there to protect their interest. And I just thought all these decisions were made on the basis of what's best for kids, and it's not true. They're made on the basis of what's best for the bottom line, what's best for profits, how big a contract can we get, how much more of a contract can we get. Right now, the biggest testing company is Pearson, which is a British company, and they've bought up the GED, which is the high school equivalency exam, and they've bought up other part. They also have bought up the teacher education component of the tests that teachers take to be certified. And you have this British company making billions of dollars from testing American students, testing American teachers, and they make lots of errors. I mean, you can go to the Google Pearson's errors, and there's an organization called Fair Test based in Massachusetts that keeps long list of the mistakes on the Pearson test. And why have we turned ourselves over, our children over, our teachers over to this corporation that creates a norm-based, standardized test which only samples a small part of what we expect children to learn? So we see in many, many schools, the things that are not tested don't get taught. We see schools and districts narrowing the curriculum, eliminating the arts, or firing arts teachers, firing their librarians, putting millions and millions more into test prep materials bought from the same vendors, buying the textbooks and the tests that are aligned to one another so that they can get higher scores. And meanwhile, what we're abandoning is the idea that schools have larger purposes than just raising test scores. The larger purposes are they're supposed to create citizens. They're supposed to educate young people to have full and rounded lives that include the arts, that include thinking and asking questions, not just answering the right question. There is something at bottom about standardized testing that is essentially authoritarian. You know, there's a right answer to everything. And a book that I have reviewed in the new issue of the New York Review of Books is by a Chinese-American scholar named Yang Zhao. Yang is a professor at the University of Oregon, and he's written a book about Chinese education and how it's so trapped in the standardized testing that students spend their entire school career learning to give the right answer. And what they have abandoned long ago in the search for the right answer is creativity, individualism, critical thinking, imagination. These are all things that we've valued in our society, which is why we have produced the greatest technological and cultural innovations of any country, because we have supported our creative thinkers. Now we're trying to hammer those creative thinkers into the same mold. All kids have to be round pegs to fit into round holes, and the square pegs will be thrown away. But that's not American education. American education has always had room for the divergent thinker, and standardized testing does not permit divergent thinking. It's all about getting the right answer.
Right, and the flip side of standardized tests is that standardized tests are supposed to be measuring standardized curriculum like the Common Core. Can you explain for our listeners what Common Core is and whether you see it as a step forward or backwards at this point?
Well, California has not yet begun to experience the bite of Common Core. Common Core was intended to be, and I say was because I don't think it ever will be, it was intended to be national standards, which would support a national curriculum, and it would be aligned with national tests. And wherever you have a national test, you have a national curriculum. And the results of these national tests would be used to evaluate teachers by test scores, which I believe is just invalid by every possible measure of validity. It was funded, the whole Common Core endeavor, which cost about over $200 million, was funded by the Gates Foundation. And this has been written about in the Washington Post. They had a front-page story about how Bill Gates agreed to finance the entire endeavor, over $200 million. Other people have calculated that the Gates Foundation has spent over $2 billion supporting the Common Core development. Now, it's not just the development that Gates has supported. He's also given millions of dollars to almost every advocacy group in Washington, D.C. So when you get a report from a think tank, whether it's on the left or the right, the odds are that they've gotten millions of dollars from the Gates Foundation specifically to advocate for Common Core. One of the allegedly progressive think tanks called the Center for American Progress just put out a report in the last few days saying that Common Core would close the gender gap. Well, how do they know that? They have no evidence whatsoever. But it reminds me of somebody saying it will cure the common cold. Well, why not say that too? Because we have no evidence for what its efficacy will be. The whole push behind Common Core, as started in 2009, was that American schools need a national curriculum, national standards, standardized instruction, and it needs to be much, much harder. And if you make it harder and more rigorous, then supposedly kids will learn more and they will have higher test scores, and our test scores will soar to the top of the world. Well, there's no evidence for any of that. As it happens, there are very high-performing nations that have national standards, but there are also very low-performing nations that have national standards. There are states like California that have some of the best standards in the country, and yet performance is low. Why is performance low? Because so many kids in California come from non-English speaking homes, and they have to learn the English language before they can begin to learn academic content. So many kids live in poverty, and poverty can be extremely distracting when you're homeless, when you haven't had proper medical care, and you haven't had a vision check or haven't been to a dentist. These things do get in the way of academic achievement. But the assumption behind Common Core is just make everything more rigorous, and everyone will learn more, and there's no evidence for it. In fact, recently, Forbes magazine had published an article by someone on their staff who writes about neuroscience, saying what is the evidence behind the Common Core. And her article, her name is Alice Walton, her article concluded that the evidence is not there, and in fact, the Common Core, particularly in the early grades, is developmentally inappropriate. And she interviewed many of the leading early childhood education specialists in the country who said children learn at different rates. They grow at different rates. Some kids in kindergarten may be ready to count from 1 to 100. Other kids won't be. What difference does it make? They'll learn in first grade. They'll learn in second grade. It doesn't matter. And yet Common Core makes these demands based on the expectation that everyone can learn in a lockstep way. And if only you set the standards high enough, everyone will achieve them. But there's no evidence for that.
Thank you for that.
One other thing I want to mention about Common Core, because it's really important, and that is that when the tests begin, that's when states find out that Common Core is a problem, because the two tests that have been funded by the federal government, by the U.S. Department of Education at a cost of $360 million, California will be using one called Smarter Balanced. Several states, I think about 13 right now, are using one called PARC, which is an acronym for something or another. I can't recall. But there are these two federally funded tests, and when states have given these tests, the passing mark has been set so high that in New York, just as an example, 70% of the kids failed the test. They didn't reach proficient, which they were expected to meet. Now, that included 97% of English language learners who did not reach proficient, 95% of the kids with disabilities, and more than 80% of the kids who were black and Hispanic who did not reach proficient. So we're left with a problem, which is if we continue on this path, the majority of our kids will not finish high school because of these standards and the tests align with them. So I think we're going to have a very serious problem until we have better leadership in education. We just have terrible leadership right now.
Another major pillar of the corporate education agenda is that bad, overpaid, unmotivated teachers are at the root of the failure in education, and that teachers' unions are responsible for shielding these bad teachers from being fired. And so they propose policies to break the power of unions, as you've mentioned, things like merit pay for teachers that raise test scores, make it easier to fire teachers who don't raise test scores, get rid of tenure and seniority, replace veteran teachers with cheaper, younger, minimally trained recruits from programs like Teach for America and so on. So what should we understand about this assault on teachers and their unions?
Well, I think that we have a very serious problem with our total misdirection in terms of teachers. The so-called reform narrative, as you said, is all about how can we fire bad teachers, as though the schools were overloaded with bad teachers. But in the meanwhile, almost all teachers now who are even aware of this political attack on them are feeling very demoralized. And there's a lot of evidence for this demoralization. And I know that in many states they have a problem with teachers literally quitting because they feel so unsupported. And we're going to face a teacher shortage, which cannot be filled by Teach for America or by anything that we're doing. In California, there has been a dramatic drop-off in the number of young people saying that they want to be teachers and entering into education programs where they can get professional training. Now, California requires that future teachers have a 4-year liberal arts degree and then enter educational programs, and those educational programs are now under-enrolled because the climate for teachers has become so hostile. Part of it in California is centered around the attacks on tenure. And tenure is not lifetime tenure. This is nonsense. And I address all these things in my book, Reign of Error. Teacher tenure does not mean a job for life. The only people who have a job for life are professors in higher education who have tenure, some of whom testified against teacher tenure, oddly enough, and also judges. Judges have lifetime tenure. And so it's kind of ironic that you have a case like the Vergara trial where the academics who are testifying against teacher tenure are themselves tenured professors. But teacher tenure means that teachers have the right to due process. It means they have the right to have a hearing, that if they have served satisfactorily for a certain length of time, and in California it's probably too short. I think it's only 19 months, which means 2 seasons of teaching. In most states it's 3 years or even 4 years. In some states it's been completely abolished. But it means nothing more than that the teacher can't be fired without just cause. And some independent person will be in a position to review the evidence. The teacher will be able to see the evidence and be able to contest it. And that's only fair because sometimes people are fired because they earn too much. And the principal would rather have 2 young teachers than 1 senior teacher. And that's wrong because we need our seniors. We need veteran teachers. We need experienced teachers. I think that if tenure were abolished, we will see parts of this country in which teachers won't dare to teach evolution, in which they won't dare to teach any of the books on the American Library Association's list of the most censored books. There was a case just recently in North Carolina where a parent complained because the teacher was teaching Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. That's a classic, but there are many classics written by people like Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, and other of the great American writers. Those books are banned. I mean, even the Harry Potter books are banned in some districts. So we have to protect academic freedom, and teachers should not be fired because they chose to teach a book that some parent objected to. So I'm very much in support of teachers having due process rights. And I would say that if you want to look at the attack on unions, the reason that unions are attacked is because they defend teachers' rights. And the people who want to be able to easily fire teachers and keep them intimidated attack unions because they are the defenders of teachers. The best evidence that I know of to say that this is wrong is to look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which are the states that consistently have the highest performance on the NAEP, which is the NAEP is a low-stakes test that nobody knows which kids took it. No child or school is labeled by their test scores. No one gets punished. No one gets rewarded. And the highest performing states are Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Connecticut. These are states that have unions. There happen to be strong unions. These are also states that have tenure for teachers, due process. If you look at the bottom of the scale of the states that consistently do the worst, they're the states where there are no unions and no due process for teachers. So there is absolutely no correlation between having a union and having good outcomes. The biggest correlation is between high poverty and low test scores. So you can have a district, for example, like the District of Columbia, where the test scores are about the lowest in the nation, despite almost 4 years of Michelle Rhee as chancellor and saying that she had the answers. She had no trouble, by the way, firing tenured teachers. She fired hundreds of teachers and principals as well, and got no results. D.C., it has a union, teachers have due process, and yet they're still fired. And they have probably this widest achievement gap between blacks and whites and between Latinos and whites of any urban district in the country.
I actually want to follow up on that. So can you say a little bit more about what the data actually shows about how race and poverty impact academic achievement, whether it's measured by tests or graduation rates or any other measures?
Well, if you want to predict test scores, the single most reliable predictor would be family income and family education. And family income matters even more than race at this point. And I quote the research by Sean Reardon. I think Sean Reardon is at Stanford, and he's an economist who found that the racial achievement gap was not nearly as large as the income achievement gap. So if you want the single most reliable predictor of low test scores, it would be family income. And then when you add into that not just poverty but segregation, it's what in my book I call it a toxic mix. And wherever there is high levels of segregation and high levels of poverty, you will find low test scores.
Thank you for that. At the core of the corporate education agenda is the drive to privatize public schools in a variety of ways. Corporatizers want to shut down public schools with low test scores and turn them over to private companies to run as taxpayer-funded charter schools or online virtual schools that often are generating profit and high executive salaries. They also want to give vouchers to families so they can use that to pay tuition at private schools, including religious schools. And this is all justified by the claim that private companies can do a better job because they can operate public schools like a business. And they say the bottom line is that every family should have a choice of a quality school, and the government has proven that it can't provide that. So let's turn the schools over to the private sector. What does the data actually say about the impact of privatization now that we've had at least 15 years of this policy?
Well, we've actually had now 20 years of charter schools and vouchers. They both got started about 1990. And in state after state, the charter schools perform about the same, and in many cases, and I don't know if it's most cases, but many cases they actually underperform the public schools. But what is, I think, very invidious about the charter movement is that the charter schools take a smaller proportion or minimal proportion of kids with special needs. They don't want them. They say they don't have the staff or facilities to deal with kids with disabilities. So then the public schools get a disproportionate number of those kids as the charter schools absorb the kids they want. The charter schools also have disproportionately small numbers of English language learners. So these are the two groups of kids who need the most intensive support and are the most expensive to educate, and they are disproportionately in public schools, not in charter schools. And you've got a skimming and a cherry picking that goes on with most of the charters. And it's been proven in state after state that this is what they do because they operate like a private business. And a private business chooses who it wants to serve and who it doesn't want to serve. And it has the ability, the charters have the ability to suspend, and they suspend at far higher rates than public schools. They also just counsel kids out. And I've heard from many principals who've said that they get the charter students, after the money has gone out, charter students will be pushed out and then sent to public schools, and they come with no resources and yet sent back to public school. Now, the kind of charter that is the most, I think, sort of unacceptable, intolerable, ridiculous, is the for-profit charter school. And some states don't permit for-profit charters, but on the other hand, they allow charter boards to hire for-profit companies to manage them. And it's crazy when you think about it that there are taxpayers paying out whatever they're paying, however many millions or billions of dollars, and some part of this has got to go to investors instead of in the classroom. It's not going to buy art supplies. It's not going to reduce class size. It's going to investors. And in Michigan, for example, close to 80% of the charter schools are operated specifically for profit, which means that the state is losing a huge amount of money to for-profit companies that have to pay their investors off. Some of these charters have gotten into trouble with the law because of hiring uncertified teachers. In some states, the charter law permits them to hire uncertified teachers. I have trouble understanding how it's going to improve the education of our nation to have large numbers of children in classrooms with uncertified teachers or teachers who've never taught before. It boggles the mind. But the worst of the charters is the virtual charter. The virtual charter is, there are a number of companies. The biggest of them is called K-12. It was founded by the former junk bond king, Michael Milken. And K-12 is a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange, and it operates for profit, and it has maybe 200,000 or more kids enrolled, and the kids get a computer, and the company gets full tuition. It provides instruction online, and the kids allegedly can, from kindergarten through 12th grade, can log on whenever they want for their instruction. Now, there have been a number of studies of K-12, and they find that there's a lot of churn. A lot of kids enroll. The tuition goes to the company, $10,000 or $12,000 per student, and then the student loses interest, doesn't log on anymore, and the company has still got the money. These virtual charters have a high dropout rate, a high churn rate. In many cases, the teachers will be monitoring anywhere from 50 to 75 to 100 different screens, and they're very low-wage teachers as compared to regular public schools or even to regular charter schools. But the companies are collecting a lot of money. They're very profitable. The last CEO of K-12 was making several $1 million a year. And I just read the transcript a few weeks ago of the stockholders meeting or the investors conference of K-12. And, here's a company that's educating 200,000 kids. And there was very little discussion of education. It was all about the bottom line, the profit, what were the odds that the numbers would go up, and all of these investors chiming in because they want to protect their money. And I think that, you read this transcript and you think this is not about education. This is about making money. And I have trouble understanding how anyone thinks this is an improvement in our educational system.
Wow, that is certainly not the story we're hearing on most media outlets.
No, the media should be all over this. And in fact, to their credit, the New York Times a few years ago had a front-page story about K-12. The Washington Post had a front-page story about K-12, but it was a one-day story. And anyone who does research will come across studies showing that the results are very poor, and yet there are states. And what's so sad about this is whether it's K-12 or whether it's a for-profit charter chain. And Ohio's a great example of this. Ohio has two charter chains that make huge amounts of money, many millions of dollars every year. And the guys who own these charter chains make very big contributions to politicians. And so you can see this kind of circle of, it's certainly not a virtuous cycle, it's probably a vicious cycle, where the corporation makes a contribution to the key politicians, and then they are never held accountable for the very bad performance of their charter schools, and they get more charters. And this has happened. I document this in my book about Ohio. It's also happened in Michigan. It's happened. This happens all the time in Florida, where terrible charter schools they come and go with regularity. They open, they close. The same operators will open another charter school, get more money, and then a few months later they'll close, but they've already collected several $100,000, and then they'll open again. It's insane. This is, by the way, called the Jeb Bush Model.
And it's so ironic, given supposedly the rationale is to hold public schools accountable, and yet there's no similar accountability for...
Well, there's not the same accountability for charter schools because they're supposed to be free of the same state regulations. So they are less accountable, and unless they just can't get any students, which has also happened, they're able to operate with minimal transparency and minimal accountability. In fact, many of these charter schools are operated by private corporations, and so they'll say, well, we're public schools, but the corporation that runs our public school is private, therefore you can't see our books and you can't audit us.
What is the record of public schools around dropouts and high school graduation, college graduation rates. That's one of the rationales for turning over schools to private interests, is that the public schools are not only failing to raise test scores, but there's a dropout crisis and there's lower graduation rates, fewer college graduation rates, at least as compared to other countries. What are the facts about that?
Well, the facts are that the reason for the lower college graduation rate is that college is so unbelievably expensive these days, and many young people sign up with for-profit online companies that end up where they end up not graduating and being saddled with massive student debt. And we forget in this country that when community colleges were started after World War II, they were free. We don't have free community college anymore, and as I show in my book, over the past 20 years or so, the states have been shifting the cost of higher education from the public to the student. And if we wanted to have higher college graduation rates, we would have free community colleges. We would have free public colleges, four-year colleges. If students were not fearful of assuming a lifetime burden or many, many years of debt, the college enrollment rates and the college graduation rates would be far higher. And frankly, I think the federal government ought to put all these for-profit colleges out of business because they do a terrible disservice to students. And the idea of extracting a profit from education is it takes away from what is available to students. And these for-profits have a terrible record. There's one, I think, that's about to go into bankruptcy called Corinthian. It's being bailed out by the federal government to ease it as it goes into bankruptcy. But it's collected many millions of dollars. And it's just unfortunate that we've allowed for-profits even to operate because they don't give a good education and they give a cheap education at a high price. So where we ought to be putting our taxpayer dollar is into making college affordable, which is to say the cost should not be a barrier to going to college. I find it ironic that on the one hand we have President Obama saying he wants to see the college graduation rate go up, but at the same time students just can't afford to go to college, and when they get there they find the debt so overwhelming that they end up dropping out. And I think that we could change that whole scenario by committing ourselves as a society to having free community colleges and, to some extent, to the greatest extent possible, free public colleges. There actually is a book on that subject, which I have on my night table, about why public higher education should be free. I personally think it should be free. I think that if students want to go to college, they should, and their income should not be a barrier. I was in Finland a few years ago, and in Finland, which we often talk about as a kind of idyllic place educationally, all higher education is free. And when I ask, or tuition free, it's costing someone, but it's not costing the students. And when I ask about how that was possible, my host, who is a very eminent scholar in Finland, said to me, education is a basic human right. You cannot charge for a basic human right. And I thought that made so much sense. And yet I continue to see that we price so many young people out of college and then blame them for not being willing to assume $40 or $50 or $80 or $100,000 or more in debt, which they will spend many years paying off. Our high school graduation rates today are at an all-time high. The Department of Education likes to make the gauge as narrow as possible, which is that you must graduate in 4 years. If you actually look at how many students or how many young people by the age of, let's say in the age group 18 to 24 have a high school diploma, it's 90%, and that's the highest it's ever been. Some kids take longer to graduate high school because they had to drop out for a year and then they come back. So what? The dropout rate today is actually the lowest it's ever been. It's under 5%. So we're actually, our kids are doing better than ever. Our schools are doing better than ever. And the reformer narrative is just a pack of manufactured crisis myths and misstatements.
Thank you for that. In your book, and again, I want to encourage our listeners to check out your book, Reign of Error. You spend the last half of the book talking about your recommendations for education, and that would be a whole other interview for us to really go into that in depth. I'm wondering if you could just, with a couple minutes left, just very briefly summarize a few of the highlights of what you think would move the country towards a more effective and equitable educational system.
What I focus on are two things that have to go together. One is improvements in the lives of children and families, which means a direct attack on poverty. And I would recommend that everybody read Bob Herbert's new book, Losing Our Way. He talks about rebuilding America, the crumbling of our infrastructure, the loss of jobs through outsourcing. I mean, I could make an argument that a lot of the attacks on school are just a way of distracting attention from what's going on in our economy, which is the further enrichment of the very wealthiest people and the 1% of the 1%. And the number of people in the middle class who are slipping out of the middle class and into poverty. So I think that we must, as a society, if we're serious, address the conditions of children and reduce poverty and reduce segregation. But at the same time, in the schools, we should insist on smaller class sizes, particularly for the kids who need it the most. We should insist that all kids have a balanced curriculum. I would like to have at least a 5-year complete moratorium on standardized testing, because I think that it has not helped at all. It's a total, in my view, almost a total waste of money. Testing should be used for diagnostic purposes only, and that is to help kids, to help teachers, not to punish them or to sort them or to label them or to rate them, but rather to see where is help needed and then bring that help where it's needed. I'd like to see a vigorous arts program in every school, because children need more than tests to keep them engaged in school. And I think the arts are essential just to be alive. It's part of the human spirit to have ways of expressing it, and we're losing it for many kids. So I think there's a long list of things, and I would include early childhood education as part of that long list. But there's so much we could do to make our schools better, and so much that we're doing today is attached to this corporate reform agenda of testing, punishing, closing schools, handing money over to private corporations. And I think all of that is taking us in the wrong direction. We should have a much more effective school system, but one that centers on the needs of children and on the joy of learning.
We've talked a lot about the concerns for the future of education. What makes you most hopeful?
Well, what makes me hopeful is the fact that we're in the midst of a national movement against all the things that I describe in my book. I mean, despite the fact that President Obama, Secretary Duncan are strong supporters of this corporate agenda, in state after state and city after city, parents and teachers are, in many cases, combining or organizing and are saying the high-stakes testing is out of control. And it's obvious that even President Obama hears this. Secretary Duncan wrote an article last week saying there are too many tests, but he's not suggesting canceling the Common Core test, which would be the beginning of rolling back the high-stakes test. What I'm very encouraged by is the anti-testing movement, because parents realize that their kids are being unnecessarily discouraged and labeled. And as people begin to understand the privatization movement, there are parents organizing against that too, because the privatization movement really has very little to show. I mean, if you think about it, all of the pieces of this corporate reform movement have failed. I mean, the charter schools do not produce higher performance. Here and there you'll find a charter school that does, but on average the charter schools do not outperform public schools, and yet we're closing down public schools to turn kids and money over to private operators. So I think that there is a growing pushback among parents, and parents are becoming more alert to the threat to public education. And every time there's an opinion poll that comes out, it turns out that while people think American education is in trouble, if you ask them about their own school, the one that they know best, they'll say, "Oh, my local school is wonderful, and we really respect our teachers." So there's a fundamental love of the local public schools, and people are reacting against the attacks, and I think that we'll see more of that as time goes by.
Thank you for that. Anything else that you want to address that we haven't covered today?
No, I think you've hit all the main points.
All righty. Well, our guest has been Dr. Diane Ravitch. She's a professor of education at New York University, an educational researcher and a historian. And again, for those of you who want more on these topics, complete with all the documentation and data that you need to go out and do battle, I encourage you to check out Diane's latest book, Reign of Error. Diane Ravitch, thank you so much for sharing your insight, your wisdom, and your inspiration with us today.
Well, thank you, Ken. It's been great to talk to you.
All right, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.